Squidville, the iconic Season 2 episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, might just be a little less unrealistic than you had assumed. This is the story in which everyone's favourite cephalopod, Squidward Tentacles, finally snaps after being tormented one too many times by his two moronic neighbours, and moves to a place which the internet has since lovingly named the Squidward Ethnostate.
Heaven at last.
Weird, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that the sort of place we're shown here in Tentacle Acres does indeed exist, sort of, and has for quite a while. And I'm also here to tell you why that matters. I'm making this video because a couple of days ago a friend of mine forwarded a meme to a group chat I'm in. This meme, specifically, on screen now. And it made me chuckle, but it also made me think back to this episode of SpongeBob. It's an episode I've not seen for a decade easily, but it's also one that stuck with me. Because what a wild premise. Squidward moves to a new squids-only neighbourhood, a sprawling infinity of homogeneity, because he's sick of living near people he views as fundamentally different from himself, even though, as we later see, they're pretty similar all in all. And because this channel is one which often takes light-hearted things way too seriously, I want to suck all the goofy zaniness from this classic SpongeBob story and replace it with a sense of biting political satire. So sit back and let me break down how the Squidward Ethnostate is a reflection of a very real phenomenon, and why you should care. First things first, I believe we can view Tentacle Acres as an ethnostate. Here's why. The geopolitics of SpongeBob's ocean have always been extremely vague. Or I guess that should be Thalassopolitics. But despite all the settlements we see in the show seeming to owe some sort of loyalty to King Neptune, they do appear to have some degree of autonomy. Just look at Tentacle Acres. They seemingly have a system of self-governance.
Here, just read this. What is it? A well-thought-out and organized list of complaints.
Add to this the obvious fact that they also have a set of strictly defined and enforced borders, and yeah, for all intents and purposes, Tentacle Acres does seem to function as a microstate, one which rigidly polices the ethnic makeup of its population. So I believe the ethnostate interpretation is on some levels a valid one, but sticking rigidly to this narrow a reading misses, I think, the point. Because even if the episode evokes the concept of ethnostate, intentionally or accidentally, it seems way more interested in another equivalency entirely. Tentacle Acres as American suburban hell. I mean, just visually, this place seems to parody the stereotypes of post-war suburbia. Rows and rows of identical houses set back from the road as far as the eye can see, with shops and other commercial amenities grouped together outside of the residential sprawl. This isn't a city planning video, so I'll spare you the rant about why this isn't the right way to design a lived environment, but it's fairly obvious that this is the primary association the episode is trying to make with the visuals of Tentacle Acres. But how do these aesthetics of suburbia link to the troubling ethnic exclusion of the setting? Well, the fit is better than you might think, because the very type of American suburbia this episode evokes has a rich history of ethnic discrimination and covert racial segregation. Take Franklin, Tennessee, for example, a suburb of Nashville. Nashville is 28% black, but the nearby suburb of Franklin is only 6.6%. Part of this is less overtly intentionally racist and more reflective of structural racism and economic inequalities. The classic American dream of leaving the city for the quietness of suburbia, the white picket fence and all that, is only achievable if you've got enough money to, buy a suburban house. And since, due to a variety of historical and sociological reasons, your average white American tends to have more Benjamins than their minority counterparts, that translates to suburbanites being disproportionately pasty. But another part of it is less accidental. According to the Vox article you're seeing now, link in the description by the way, the majority of white suburban house hunters profess a sort of open-mindedness towards neighbourhood demographics, but in reality search for and buy places in majority white areas almost exclusively. When it comes to minorities, there's a far smaller disconnect between the sort of neighbourhoods they claim to want and the sorts they actually search for, but it goes far beyond this. There's a deeply embedded mistrust of America's non-white citizens and the quote foreign influence they might bring within white Americans, and according to recent polls, this fear is growing. It goes beyond fear, prejudice, and bias, however, because the political and logistical mechanisms of these white suburban neighbourhoods actually contain all the tools necessary to covertly limit the influx of non-desired ethnicities into these waspy paradises. Through small-scale political assemblages, such as homeowners associations, through conservative urbanist movements like NIMBY laws and ordinances, that stands for not in my backyard, by the way, the dominant demographic in many a North American suburb is able to build up barrier after barrier between their racially homogenous neighbourhoods and home-seeking minorities. And the erection of ethnic barricades between neighbourhoods or between the city and the suburbs is sadly a practice with a rich history. While some forms of overt segregation were clamped down on, relevant here are methods such as so-called covenants, which were essentially neighbourhood contracts each inhabitant signed, which prohibited homeowners from selling their properties to African Americans, and these persisted until 1948. It's around this time that the so-called white flight began, with the mass expansion of suburbia being fueled by an equally large-scale exodus of white property owners from inner cities to these new, essentially homogenous places. And while legal methods of property discrimination, such as covenants, were becoming less common, de facto methods sprang up to take their place, such as exclusionary zoning laws, or the manufacture of stories in suburban newspapers about confrontation and violence whenever a black person moved in. Andrew Wise, in the book Places of Their Own, African American Suburbanization in the 20th Century, runs through a lot of these methods in the decades following the Second World War, and for him, the best way to conceptualize the presence of African Americans in suburbia is as forbidden neighbors. If you want to learn more about the ways the expansion of American suburbia was umbilically tied to systematic methods of racial oppression and segregation, there's a link to this book in the description. Wise goes into detail about how suburbanization was closely related to the making of race and class identities in the post-war period, for instance discussing ways in which the creation of segregated suburbs allowed European immigrants to access social and economic mobility. But the key takeaway in my eyes is, and I'm quoting here, that throughout the post-war period, numerous suburbs used state and federal funds to demolish African American communities and redevelop them for other uses. So the inherently racist image of the suburb, as invoked by SpongeBob with Tentacle Acres, was a real thing. And by converting it into an overt ethnostate, this episode of SpongeBob might be reaching towards political commentary on the inbuilt racism of suburban culture and zoning laws. And yeah, some of these methods of exclusion have fallen away in the past few decades, but many haven't, particularly issues with zoning. And with the increasing xenophobia of many segments of white America we've seen in the past few years, this self-segregation hasn't disappeared, not yet. Increasingly, we're seeing exurbs form, communities either further out than suburbs or separated in different ways, like further economic barriers or often literal gates and walls. Sound familiar? Because it should. The existence of seemingly placid, serene residential utopias cut off from the mayhem of the city is a constant, both in our world and the world of Bob L'Éponge. But also a constant is the dark implications that places like this bring. After all, the type of person who wants to literally or metaphorically wall themselves and their like-minded friends away from the outside world and different groups of people probably has deeper-rooted and more dangerous issues than an affinity for white picket fences. And to its credit, SpongeBob recognized this. After spending a while living in this little pocket of mono-ethnic suburbia, Squidward wises up to the limitations of shutting oneself off from the rest of the world, and their differing cultures and practices, and so in the ultimate act of rebellion, he misuses the reef blower, the symbol of non-squid behaviour which initially drove him to seek refuge in the enforced homogeneity of Tentacle Acres, in order to escape from the rows of identical houses and organised oppression of this suburban stand-in. And I think that's a pretty powerful final gesture for this episode, albeit one full of SpongeBob's trademark goofiness. Even filtered through the intense zaniness of this show, this story is a pretty solid refutation of the historic and ongoing racial problems linked to issues of local policy and zoning that many remain largely unaware of. And with racism and distrust spreading throughout society once more, with the new white flight away from diversity and towards exurbs and NIMBYism, I think we need a few more Squidwards. People who recognise these systems of discrimination and the flaws within them, and work against both their own preconceived notions and the exclusionary attitudes of their peers for a betterment of their society achieved through tolerance instead of segregation and enforced homogeneity. As I'm finishing the writing of this script, I've just received a comment on an older video, which said something along the lines of, "Wow, I see why you're called Pillar of Garbage. You're just making up theories out of thin air, and who even cares about any of this?" I can't quote it verbatim or show it on screen because the user edited their comment shortly thereafter, and all I've been able to think about since then is, wow, if someone reacted that way to that video, I sure hope they don't watch this one. Their brain would likely implode with the perceived pointlessness of this topic. But I hope some of you enjoyed finding out about the ways the Squidward ethnostate resembles, and maybe even comments on the deeply tainted history of American suburbia. And as with every slightly out there video I make, even though the tone is firmly tongue-in-cheek, I wouldn't have put all this time into writing, recording, and producing a video which is near guaranteed to underperform on a statistical level if I didn't ultimately think there was something worth talking about, an idea worth thinking about at the heart of this. So if there's anyone watching this who thinks I've wasted their time, I'm sorry you feel that way. But I'm willing to bet there's at least a few people out there who enjoy looking at familiar stories, even silly ones from a 20-year-old SpongeBob episode from new perspectives, and considering the ways they can intersect with reality and real issues. And I apologise, but those are the people for whom I make these videos. So if you're one of them, thanks for watching, I really hope you enjoyed. And special thanks as always to my patrons on screen now, especially Ian Fifield.